they were, for what we know, in the operations room of that brigade when the strike was happening. They were responsible for what the IDF is calling this misidentification of a gun of a specific person who they thought was a gunman, but now they're saying actually he was carrying a bag which we thought was a rifle, and they were the ones who gave the orders to carry out the strike, basically 3 strikes on 3 separate vehicles, which, according to what the IDF is saying, was against the standard operating procedure, whereby after 1 strike, you would have to check again to see if the targets were legitimate, which they didn't do.
Now to Israel, where the Israeli Defense Forces have sacked 2 senior officers over the airstrike that killed 7 aid workers in Gaza on Monday. It said the incident was a grave mistake and that the workers were mistaken for Hamas terrorists. It comes after Israel opened new aid routes into the enclave following a conversation between the US President Joe Biden and the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu last night. Here is Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, speaking earlier.
We welcome the steps that have been announced by Israel, opening Erez as a new crossing point, having shipments go directly from the Ashdod port, maximizing the route from Jordan. These are positive developments, but the real test is results. And that's what we're looking to see in the coming days and in the coming weeks.
I'm joined now by Anshel Pfeffer, who's been reporting for The Times from Israel. Hello.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Anshel. Thanks very much for joining us. So what has the IDF been saying in this report? We know its conclusion is that the incident was a grave mistake, but what else have they found?
Well, according to the IDF, the series of mistakes is quite tragic. It began with what they say was very good coordination between the upper echelons of the IDF with the World Central Kitchen organization. They were allowed, the first organization basically, to be allowed just 2 weeks ago to bring in supplies from the sea to Gaza. They set up a pier on the coast of Gaza City. And in recent days, they were beginning to move those supplies to where they were needed within Gaza City. And one of those convoys, basically the second convoy, the details of it were handed properly over to the IDF, but somewhere in the chain of command, the full details didn't get through to the brigade, which was in charge of securing the specific area where the convoy was going. And that's where this chain of mistakes and operational misjudgements, what they're calling them, happened, with the drone operators not missing the fact that the WCK was using some kind of vehicles there which were not just the supply trucks, the fact that there was apparently some kind of infiltration by Hamas fighters of part of the convoy, but that part wasn't the part that they were tracking. They were tracking another part, and that was when the drone attack happened and they killed the 7 employees of the organization.
And what do we know about the 2 officers who have now been sacked?
Well, they were, for what we know, in the operations room of that brigade when the strike was happening. They were responsible for what the IDF is calling this misidentification of a gun of a specific person who they thought was a gunman, but now they're saying actually he was carrying a bag which we thought was a rifle, and they were the ones who gave the orders to carry out the strike, basically 3 strikes on 3 separate vehicles, which, according to what the IDF is saying, was against the standard operating procedure, whereby after 1 strike, you would have to check again to see if the targets were legitimate, which they didn't do.
And what are the political consequences likely to be from these failings by the IDF? Is the decision to open up new aid routes into Gaza following pressure from the US an early sign that, this mistake is going to have political and diplomatic consequences for Israel?
Well, Netanyahu was obviously really shook by this conversation he had with Biden yesterday afternoon, because he immediately went into cabinet and passed a vote opening these new routes, or basically old routes, because they were in use before the war, but haven't been used for the last 6 months, new routes of supplies through Israel to Gaza. But the way that Netanyahu did that showed just his political problem. He rushed to hold the vote at the beginning of the cabinet meeting. You cover cabinet in the UK, you know that votes are usually held at the end of a meeting. But the reason Netanyahu rushed to do that was because the main far-right minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, the national security minister, who has a very hard line against supplies going into Gaza, wasn't yet at the meeting. So Netanyahu rushed the decision through instead of confronting him. It shows how Netanyahu is scared of his far-right partners and incapable of taking them on. At the same time, he's scared of Joe Biden, so he sneaked this decision through. And when the minister arrived, the decision had already been made and publicized. So Netanyahu kind of got away with that.
Well, you've got a piece going live on the Times website later talking about Netanyahu as a great survivor. Tell us a bit about that, and will that remain the case as the dust settles here?
Netanyahu's playing for time. He's now been prime minister for 6 months since this war began, or in 2 days it'll be 6 months. And from the beginning of this war, his ratings were down on the floor. I mean, he'd gone down to about 20% support, which is the lowest he's ever had. If an election was held now, he'd be booted out. The parties of his coalition would all be thrown into opposition. So he knows this. Within the government, there's a lot of criticism of him within the coalition, but at the same time, he's manipulating the coalition in a way that they know that they'll go down with him. And the level of power that they have now over him, and the level of power they have in general, is something that they won't get again if elections are held. So he's kind of holding them trapped with him. And at the same time, there's also this additional party of Benny Gantz, which is a centrist party, which joined the emergency coalition 4 days after the war began. And they're full of criticism to Netanyahu. They don't see him as a leader. They think he's causing terrible damage to Israel. But at the same time, they're worried that if they're not in cabinet where the decisions are being made, then it'll just be Netanyahu and the far-right nutters. So they're also trapped. And Netanyahu is using this to stay on. The Knesset session, Israel's parliament, the session was ending this weekend. That means he gets another couple of months until the Knesset reconvenes. So Netanyahu, every day he's surviving is a win for him.
Well, Anshel Pfeffer reporting for the Times from Israel. Thanks very much for joining us on Times Radio. Talks to that breaking news from Israel, that report from the Israeli Defense Forces describing the mistaken attack on the aid convoy on Monday as a grave mistake. They say in that report they misidentified the convoy as Hamas terrorists. There'll doubtless be more fallout over the course of the day from Israel, and we'll bring it to you as it happens here on Times Radio.